webinar of 2026. Today, we are going to be covering the fight for abortion rights in the states, anti-abortion state policies and strategies to expect in the coming year. So I will go ahead and jump into it. First, I'm going to introduce myself. I will be one of your co-hosts today. My name is Jessica Ensley. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Vice President of Outreach here at REPRO Action, and I am based in DC. And I will pass it over to Victoria.
Hey everyone, I'm Victoria Lambert. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Associate Director of Local Strategies at REPRO Action, and I am based in Richmond, Virginia.
Great, thank you. So a quick overview of what our agenda will look like today. I'll go ahead and introduce the organization. I will pass it over to Victoria to walk us through today's topic. And then we're going to go ahead and get into the discussion with our wonderful panelists before we head on over to next steps in Q&A. If at any point while we're going over this material you have questions, feel free to enter them into the chat and we will get to them during the last portion of the webinar. And you can follow our conversation by joining us on Blue Sky, following the hashtag ReproAction or following our account at ReproAction. So to start off, ReproAction leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are known for our left-flank analysis, our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they be allies or opposition, and our commitment to nonviolent direct action. And with that, I will pass it over to Victoria to get us started on today's topic.
All right, so before we dive into predictions for state anti-abortion policy trends for this year, I want to give a little bit of background, just a high-level overview of anti-abortion policy trends from 2025. If you want a deep dive on 2025 reproductive health and rights policy, I highly recommend checking out Guttmacher's recently released 2025 state policy analysis. So one trend at the state level in 2025—
Sorry, Victoria. I'm just going to jump in real quick. I can hear you okay. You're breaking up just a little bit. I would either maybe get closer to the mic or maybe switch if you're using headphones or something.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me better now?
I can. It's just a little bit fuzzy, but I think we can hear you okay.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so one trend from 2025 in terms of state anti-abortion policy was attacks on medication abortion and telehealth abortion in states with existing abortion bans. So the aim of this type of legislation was really to keep people from abortion ban states from accessing care, because people in those states are increasingly only able to access care through telehealth or medication abortion. And probably the most prominent example of this was Texas HB 7, which allows Texas citizens to anyone who mails, transports, delivers, or prescribes abortion medication in the state. And it also allows similar lawsuits against manufacturers and distributors of abortion pills in Texas. Another set of bills that attacked medication abortion in 2025 was bills focused on the unfounded and unscientific claim that mifepristone pollutes water supply. This claim originates from the anti-abortion organization Students for Life of America and has been debunked by environmental scientists, including experts in public water pollution. While none of these bills were passed in 2025, there was an uptick in the number of bills across states that were introduced. There was also an increase in fetal personhood bills across states in 2025. These are bills that would grant full legal rights to embryos and fetuses from the moment of fertilization, and it includes bills that explicitly criminalize pregnant people. In 2025, there was also a record number of bills introduced and passed that were inspired by live action disinformation video, Meet Baby Olivia. While anti-abortion leaders and legislators claim that this video teaches about fetal development, it really is just propaganda for anti-abortion lies, and the video uses inflammatory rhetoric that's been debunked by numerous medical professionals. Not all of these bills across states actually require Baby Olivia, but because they are inspired by Baby Olivia content that was made by Live Action, it's quite troubling. Live Action is an extreme anti-abortion group with ties to multiple violent individuals. Also, its founder and leader, Lila Rose, has taken stances against IVF and contraception, and has also widely disseminated the dangerous lie that abortion is never medically necessary. Finally, in 2025, there was a coordinated effort from both national and local anti-abortion groups to impact Virginia's statewide elections in the fall. These elections, especially the election of the Virginia House of Delegates, were critical to the approval of the state's reproductive freedom amendment. So these groups really went hard in trying to influence the outcome of those elections. And some examples of this were Students for Life of America and Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America promoting a now debunked story about a public school employee in Fairfax County, Virginia, who was alleged to have helped students access abortion care. And these two organizations also sent people to door knock in Virginia ahead of the statewide elections. So moving on to trends that are likely to come up in 2026. We will very likely see more attacks on medication and telehealth abortion this year. Policy priorities released by anti-abortion organizations signal their intent to focus on medication abortion. It's also worth noting that within the past year, abortion opponents have amped up disinformation about the safety of mifepristone. This was largely in response to a report released in spring of last year by the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which claimed that the complications of mifepristone are more frequent than has been previously reported. To be very clear, there's been 25 years of evidence that has shown that mifepristone is extremely safe and effective. But the Ethics and Public Policy Center tried to frame the report as a rigorous study, even though it didn't go through peer review, and its methodology has been widely criticized by medical professionals and researchers who have years of experience in conducting research in this field. The report laid the disinformation groundwork for fulfilling Project 2025's promise to revoke FDA approval of mifepristone, which abortion opponents have since been calling for in the past year. This disinformation is likely to fuel more state policy attacks on mifepristone in 2026 under the guise of protecting pregnant people. And one way that this may show up is copycat bills in other states of Texas's HB7, which I mentioned in the last slide. There have already been similar bills filed in Florida and Indiana this session, which allow private citizens to sue providers of medication abortion. Other ways that this might show up is through bills that are specifically based in the amped up disinformation that has been going on in the past year about the safety and environmental impacts of mifepristone. So one example of this is legislation that allows wrongful death and complication lawsuits related to mifepristone. National Right to Life is pushing their model bill, which they're calling the Abortion Pill Provider Liability Education Act. This bill was introduced in Ohio last year, and it requires prescribers of mifepristone to give disinformation about abortion based in some of the disinformation I talked about earlier. It also introduces a liability framework that allows citizens to sue providers, manufacturers, and distributors for complications of mifepristone. Another set of anti-abortion bills that may pop up in this category is legislation that marks abortion medication as controlled substances. This type of legislation passed in Louisiana a couple of years ago, but it's very likely that it'll pop up across states this year, given the amped up disinformation about the alleged harms of mifepristone, which are untrue. And then finally, within this category, there will likely be legislation that is continues to be introduced that's based in this bogus claim that mifepristone has a negative environmental impact. In 2026, there will also likely continue to be an increase, at least in the introduction of bills that criminalize pregnancy outcomes. The faction of the anti-abortion movement that wants to see pregnant people criminalized for self-managing their own abortions. That faction is increasingly vocal and active at the state level. So these bills will probably continue to get introduced and get attention this year. And then finally, there will be more bills at the state level this year, inspired by live action's Meet Baby Olivia video. As of last week, there are already 32 of these bills filed in this legislative session across states. Also in 2026, there may be a number of ballot measures across states that impact abortion access. So Virginia, Nevada, Idaho, and Oregon may all have ballot measures in the fall that expand or secure access to abortion, while Nebraska, Missouri, and Wyoming may have ballot measures that would reduce abortion access. When these ballot measures have come up in states previously, anti-abortion national organizations have gotten involved in these campaigns and initiatives. And already this year, we've seen several groups signal that they intend to get involved in either opposing or supporting these initiatives at the state level. This includes Students for Life of America, the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and Operation Save America, groups which have all indicated that it's a priority for them to get involved in these campaigns this year. And with that, I will pass it back to Jessica.
Great. Thank you so much, Victoria, for walking us through what we've seen and what we may see in the coming year. And right now, it is my pleasure to introduce our first panelist. So that is N. Sini Jamat. Uses she, her pronouns. Sini is a public health professional and internal medicine physician excited to provide a medical perspective within the reproductive justice framework to shape and influence public policy, patient outcomes, and culture. She has had a diverse career dedicated to international public health and research. As the Director of Policy for Reproductive Rights at State Innovative Exchange, also known as SIX, she serves as a trusted resource providing year-round guidance, hands-on assistance, tools, and skills building to support state lawmakers in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories on the full spectrum of reproductive rights issues. Sydney has completed residency in general internal medicine at Duke University Medical Center. She earned a Master of Public Health at Columbia University in the Population and Family Health Department, and additionally, she participated in the Aaron J. Woolley Fellowship, which is a reproductive justice leadership development program at the Feminist Center for Reproductive Liberation in Atlanta. In her free time, she enjoys learning Spanish and hiking to the top of mountains to practice yoga under the sun, which sounds incredible. Sydney, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for introducing me.
Absolutely. Our first question for you is, how do you think the fight for abortion rights at the state level will change for 2026 compared to last year?
Uh, to begin, I want to expand on what Victoria was talking about. We really need to talk about the volume. State legislatures continue to introduce bills at a record-setting pace. In just the first half of 2025, lawmakers introduced a record 130,000 bills. So for 2026, many legislative sessions started in January, and SIX is already tracking 600 plus reproductive health rights and justice bills. And it's important to note that anti-abortion bills reflect a coordinated national strategy, often sharing identical language across states. Another difference between 2025 and 2026 is that last year, states were focused on responding to the Supreme Court decisions related to EMTALA and medication abortion access. Thus, there was a clear and urgent focus on strengthening protections. This year, the attacks at SCOTUS are on the LGBTQIA plus community, including trans youth in sports and ending conversion therapy bans. Therefore, while the threat to abortion care remains strong, it is principally in state courts and lower federal courts, so legislation will be more tailored to state-specific threats. With all that in mind, compared to 2026, I anticipate that in the fight for abortion rights at the state level, we will see an escalating aggressive agenda by anti-abortion extremists and politicians, introducing more egregious laws in even more states. And in fact, the vice president has said, most of what's, and quote, most of what's going to happen over the next generation of the pro-life movement is we're going to have to win victories at the state level. So, state legislatures are now the primary battleground for reproductive rights. Moreover, this new wave of extreme anti-abortion bills in the 2026 legislative sessions go far beyond regulating abortion care and instead redefine pregnancy as itself as a matter of criminal law. It's no longer just about clinics, and the fight for abortion access is about whether pregnancy becomes grounds for punishment by the state. However, I happily expect to see an innovative policy agenda from pro-abortion legislators. And proactive bills we expect and hope to see more of in 2026 are repealing state abortion restrictions. And a great example of volume is in Arizona, where in 2024 they had Proposition 139, which was a ballot initiative, and amended the state constitution to establish a fundamental right to abortion care. And then in 2025, the Arizona Proactive Reproductive Justice Alliance, with three sponsors, including Senator Annalise Ortiz and Representative Sarah Liguri, they introduced SB 153, which was an omnibus repeal bill. But then in this year, on MLK's birthday, they introduced three bills in the Senate and three companion bills in the House, with a total of 15 sponsors. And it was an omnibus repeal bill, a young person's access bill, repealing notarized parental consent, and a fetal personhood repeal bill. And so these proactive bills in Arizona are just a great example of the increased volume of bills we see annually. On the positive side, on our side. Number two, in terms of proactive bills we expect and hope to see more of in 26 are state versions of the FACE Act to prevent attacks against abortion clinics. Since the federal FACE Act ceased being enforced, barring extraordinary circumstances, freedom of access to clinic entrances or FACE Act corollaries and other creative state legislative strategies are an essential opportunity to address clinic violence and protect communities. Number three, we'll see protecting EMTALA standards for abortion, for emergency abortion care, and for funding abortion care with state resources. Using the unused Affordable Care Act premiums like the public health abortion grant funding that we saw in Maryland with HB 930.
Great. Thank you so much for walking us through that and some of the positive state and local legislation and proposals that we've been seeing. It's very helpful. Expanding upon that a bit, we know the anti-abortion movement for the longest time has been really focused on state and local legislation. And I believe the quote that you had from J.D. Vance and uplifting that anti-abortion advocates should focus on the state was from like this March for Life, which was this Friday. So I wanted to ask you, is there any upcoming anti-abortion state legislation that you're most concerned about? And how do you go about advising state legislators and advocates to prevent those proposals from happening?
Okay. So first, it's really important to note that politicians who vote against abortion care have a playbook, and they've been using it for more than 50 years to impose social control. And as I stated earlier, in 2026, we are witnessing an escalation. It's not a retreat after Dobbs. And now it's about punishment, or even more so, punishment, control, and political signaling, even in states where voters have already affirmed abortion rights. So concerning state legislation for 2026 includes really criminalization and personhood. Several bills revive so-called prenatal equal protection or personhood frameworks, which attempt to treat embryos and fetuses as full legal persons. The practical effect is to lay the groundwork for homicide-style prosecution, not just of providers, but potentially of patients and people who experience pregnancy loss. This is an intentional strategy to collapse abortion care, miscarriage care, and IVF into the criminal code. Next, I'm concerned about defying the voters in 2026. Many of these bills are being introduced after voters have protected abortion access through ballot measures or constitutional amendments. It's part of a broader pattern of legislative defiance of democracy, especially on reproductive freedom. So, lawmakers are openly testing how far they can go to override the will of voters. These bills are often clearly meant to provoke court challenges, moving the case up through the courts to SCOTUS, which means a racist and sexist state law, often from regions of the country with problematic histories, really now become the law for the entire country. So, when we train state legislators, we begin by talking to them about a new wave of trap laws being introduced and an opportunity to really fight differently. And we explain to legislators the need for them to be comfortable and strong talking about abortion care and reproductive justice in 2026. So, if you're talking about childcare, if you're talking about IVF, you need to be able to speak confidently about abortion care and reproductive justice. And we're talking about a system. Our opposition is laser focused on this system, and we should be too. The two questions the opposition and the reproductive justice framework ask lead to two very different ends. One asks how to regulate a system, and the other asks how to make the system more just. And this is the central lens that we're encouraging state legislators to view the legislation that crosses their desk because the harm is real, right? It's immediate. We have increased confusion, delayed care, provider shortages, and people being coerced to carry pregnancies against their will.
Thank you for walking us through that. You've touched on some of these in relation to my last question for you for the moment. Um, Based on the close work with state lawmakers, is there any specific rhetoric and tactics that is most troubling? Is it as you mentioned, the anti-democracy tactics of voters reaffirming their support for abortion and then going after it? Is it the shield laws, the trap laws? Or is there anything else that is concerning that you want to dive a little bit deeper into?
Yes, and I think it's really important to talk about the political violence and an intimidation against our reproductive health rights and justice champions, right? Our legislators face political violence, censure in the state house from their colleagues, and constant attacks on their safety. And in 2025, we saw the murder of Minnesota Speaker of the House of Representatives Melissa Hortman and her husband, as well as the shooting of Minnesota Senator John Hoffman and his wife. And then, in fact, this weekend, we saw Florida Representative Maxwell Alejandro Frost was punched in the face at the Sundance Film Festival, right? And despite these personal assaults, state legislators remain committed to speaking their values and speaking up for their communities. Uh, the second thing is that unfortunately, we're seeing a normalization of harming pregnant people that's gaining momentum. With the repeated reintroduction of bills that have failed, each year these harmful bills make incremental progress towards passage. And even when bill sponsors know legislation is unlikely to pass, introducing radical bills normalizes extreme ideas and shifts the policy conversation further to the right. And the most notable example, really, penalizing pregnant people who access abortion care with imprisonment and felony murder. And third, as I mentioned earlier, is just flooding the state legislatures with bills. Um, and this volume really reflects how powerful and wealthy donors are propping up this relatively small but very extreme anti-abortion movement. And we see the same anti-abortion bills introduced as carbon copies in multiple states each session as they really parade the same cast of extremists to testify in committee hearings across the country. However, to counter our opponents, I'll end with highlighting the winning model that Six embraces, which is collaborative governance. And this is where elected officials, their constituents, and civil society leaders build, shape, and sustain shared power in service of racial, social, and economic justice within our multiracial society. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sydney, for taking the time out to walk us through some of the focuses, both what's positively happening at the state level and then items that we should absolutely be watching for and fighting back against. And if folks have questions for Sydney or any of our other panelists as we're going throughout this, please enter them in the question section of this webinar. And with that, I will pass it over to Victoria to introduce us to our next panelist.
Thanks, Jessica. So our next panelist is Raven E. Freeborn. Raven uses they, them pronouns and is a queer, savvy Southerner, dissenter, loving, and organizing in Texas. They are guided by Black feminist wisdom, justice, and a spirit of playfulness. Raven specializes in political and movement strategy, coalition building, facilitation, and coaching executive and seniors. They lead as executive director of Avow, a multi-entity organization building power for reproductive justice with and for Texans. Additionally, Raven is the founder of Legacy Healing and Therapy Services, where they support communities in addressing persistent patterns of oppression through a healing justice approach. Ultimately, their work aims to revitalize public health infrastructures to improve conditions for Black and Brown, queer, and trans folks. With a background in social work, birth work, and mental health, Raven bridges human and political development to catalyze systems transformation. Inspired by poetry and grounded in nature, Raven's leadership is a joyful, restorative practice rooted in community and collective liberation. Thank you so much for joining us, Raven.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Raven, my first question for you is related to Texas HB 7, which I mentioned in the introduction slides. And just as a reminder to those joining us today, this bill allows private citizens to sue people and entities that provide, distribute, mail, manufacture, medication, abortion. And so my question for this, around this bill is, related to how, unfortunately, Texas can be a harbinger of anti-abortion legislation that pops up across other states. So, Raven, can you speak to the consequences that you believe this law will have in Texas and share any advice for advocates who may be fighting similar legislation to HB 7?
Absolutely. So first, just greeting everyone who's here. Happy Tuesday. I believe that's today. I don't know. We have snow in Texas, so everything is off. I want to first start with the consequences of HB 7. Okay. So there are probably a litany of them that I could list, but what really stands out for us is that this continues to outsize the power between states, citizens, and neighbors. It discredits personal decision-making and privacy protections for abortion seekers. It gives fuel to this misinformation mill that our opponents have constructed. It increases the weight of risk across our network, knowing that the whole crux of HB 7, it exists because we know that our abortion network across the continent and the globe is strong. And so in order for them to find success, they have to chip away at what they think is our strength. So it's going to increase that weight of the risk across our network. It slows down healthcare access and decision-making for people who are seeking abortion. And what has always felt really important to me to lift up is who's living in the intersections of policies like this. And so when the state gives credit to people being able to create lawsuits, these civil lawsuits around what they may disagree with, it creates more opportunity for individuals who are using harm in their relationships to continue to now use this tactic as a form of violence or reproductive coercion. Ultimately, HB 7, which went in effect in December of 2025, it does what we don't seek to do, essentially. What we're standing for at Avow is that we're looking to affirm abortion seekers. We want to affirm abortion providers and havers. We want to equip neighbors with trusted information and resources that can be shared across communities. And we want to strengthen democratic and public health ecosystems. So with those three things in mind, to advocates and colleagues across the country, here's what we can share as advice for your legislative session this year. We understand that our opponents have weakened the managed care system by overturning the legality of abortion health care. HB 7 and bills like it use a whittling tactic. So as Sydney was sharing, that this is a system, it's a coordinated system, our opponents are, that are using strategies and tactics And we often say that they're going to copycat a bill, right? Or they're just going to take this language and place it somewhere else. While that is true, I also want us to see how the tactic is is iterated over time and is changing at scale. So with a bill like this passing in HB7, it changes the scale of possibility for your opponents. So a tactic that is whittling or deteriorating the strength of our network to deliver care is what HB7 is meant to do. We know that anti-abortion factions and their elected officials are enraged by the effectiveness of the abortion care ecosystem that spans localities, states, and continents. So why else would a legislative body in Texas deem it necessary to pass another abortion ban in a state with a total ban and many layers of historical restrictions? I don't want to give us false hope or to virtue signal that it is because we are winning. While it may not be because we are winning, it is because we are strong. So advocates who are fighting these whittling tactics must act with urgency to strengthen the protections for any exposed or vulnerable parts of your ecosystem. That means that your legislative work has to have a power analysis, and that power analysis has to determine what parts of the ecosystem are at threat of being targeted through this whittling tactic. So yes, the copycat bill of HB7, but how else can they whittle power from what we have to build because states are manufacturing continued crises? So this could look like checking on your funding systems like abortion and practical support funds, support systems like abortion doulas, community care providers, our legal defense groups, and even the infrastructure systems, like literally the roads we drive on, the digital highways where information travels and is shared or directed, and this entire payment scheme between states and communities or communities and communities, counties and communities. So looking at the places where directed and indirect payment systems or reimbursements could support reproductive health access. All of these points of our ecosystem could be at threat or at risk of being targeted through this whittling tactic. So that's first step, right? Have a power analysis to accompany your legislative work and investigate the places where there are exposed or eventual risk. Secondly, I want to encourage advocates to enhance our narrative strategy so that we help our supporters investigate what is often in plain sight. What we know about HB7 is that it's titled the Women and Children's Protection Act. That is an audacious title. Our opponents are on a mission to restore what they call common sense. So they're using plain language to disguise political overreach as protection. We must continue to look at the places where threat can be hidden and help our supporters to understand that. Part of Avow's work, which I'll talk about later, is also thinking about how we strengthen the reproductive justice framework within our electorate. So lastly, we have to remember that issue-based continued education, political conscious raising, and message training is necessary for our long-standing partners because it makes them champions of the system, not just the solution. We are going to need many strategies to win. However, we cannot allow the use of many strategies to dilute the power of political education and issue-based continuing education on the reality that abortion is healthcare. If your champions are standing beside you, are they only amplifying the solution or are they being champions of the entire ecosystem that we have to hold and protect?
Thank you so much for that, Raven. Yeah, it's so helpful for you to share the strategies, but also I think just backing up, like you said, and thinking more broadly about the total environment and how else our opponents might go after our network of abortion access. That's incredibly helpful. So you spoke briefly about Avow's strategies, but I want to ask you a little bit more specifically about that. So Avow is boldly standing up for reproductive justice in the face of anti-abortion extremism. And I think the work that you all do can be an incredible model for advocates and other states facing similar attacks. Can you share some of the most effective strategies you've found for fighting anti-abortion extremism in Texas?
Absolutely. I love this question because this is both something that's new for Avow as we have pivoted to a power building approach, and it continues to highlight that what's happening in states where abortion access is restricted, and while some of those states are in the South, what's happening here is still an opportunity to share these innovative and creative strategies that we have to come up with in order to live in a society that we deserve to live in. So, there are a couple of things that Avow has done over time that have continued to be effective for our work, no matter which way our strategy is facing. The first one is to think about the power of our narratives and how we are affirming abortion and boldly saying abortion everywhere that we can. We know that being pro-abortion in the reproductive justice space means that we're thinking more broadly about the system and the material conditions of our neighbors across the state of Texas. And so, as I said, we seek to affirm abortion seekers, providers, and havers. And one of the ways that we're thinking about this is amplifying our shared cultural values so that we can expose the consequences and the contradictions of abortion bans and restrictions on our bodily autonomy. The second space is to think about how we are pulling on transformation at every level of society. So, Texas being a very large state itself, we have to think about the scale of the problem at the place of our state legislature, but also how our local cities and counties set up to advance reproductive justice protections. I like to say that we're so good at this local level work, thinking about even what a local area can do to reimburse or provide direct payment support for reproductive health care. Right? We've been able to do that in Texas, and we were so good at it that they outlawed it at the state level this year. And still, right, we want to continue to push by organizing and canvassing and building a relational ladder that supports people in their leadership development. So we know that there are two other strategies that we've got to pull on, right? So whether our organizing is relational, we must continue to canvass year round. We are holding a deep canvassing program in the state. And this deep canvassing program is intended to have conversations at the door and move people up a value-centered scale to where we can find our commonalities and push them towards the side of the world that we are building, where we see abortion as healthcare and we affirm abortion seekers, providers, and havers. And the last thing that I'll say here is that holds two different strategies for us. That's strengthening the Texas progressives ecosystem so that we can actually secure and protect full spectrum reproductive health care as a fundamental human right. And lastly, we want to think about equipping and connecting our pro-abortion advocates so that they are community pollinators. We want them to share trusted information, resources, and civic and political education with their neighbors. And to punctuate that, I just want to continue to say that we have to push political consciousness raising. We have to share issue-based education so that we can confront the common sense, in quotes, that our opponents say that they're attempting to bring back to society, which is actually dredging us back into draconian measures. So those things are the places and the ways where Avow is continuing to expand our strategy and fight anti-abortion extremism in our states.
Thank you so much for that, Raven. Super helpful to have that breakdown of the ways that you can fight back against, are fighting back against anti-abortion extremism in Texas. I have one more question for you for now, Raven, and it's related to how Texas has gained attention in recent years, not only for its anti-abortion policies, but also for its worsening maternal health outcomes, which we know are related because we know that people in states with abortion bans are more likely to die while pregnant or during childbirth. And this risk is higher, especially for Black mothers. So, Raven, in addition to opposing abortion bans and restrictions, what other policies and strategies is Avow advocating for to address the Black maternal health crisis?
This is a great question. As we are pivoting towards building power for reproductive justice, this includes widening our span of the material conditions and the social determinants of health that are facing Texans. As we're talking about this issue of the Black maternal health crisis, it's important to me to lift up the life and the legacy that we are now advocating through Tierra Walker. Tierra Walker was a young mother in Texas, in San Antonio, Texas, who died due to the delayed provision of healthcare. We can assume or presume in Tierra's case that if she were provided with an option to seek abortion healthcare, she may have had a different outcome. And after the death of Tierra Walker, I got to write an op-ed that our wonderful team helped get across the finish line. And in that, I share a troubling anecdote that we are only talking about the care that Black women and Black birthing people deserve while we stand beside their grave sites, while we light candles in vigil of their memory, and while we prepare for their body to lay at rest. This is the place of that conversation. However, I've noticed that we are charioting white survivors of abortion, of not having access to abortion care, excuse me, we're charioting those white survivors from court case to documentaries to panels and discussions. And so just noticing the difference between where the conversation happens and the place of life or in the place of death, I think is an important thing for us to lift up. The second thing is that I feel that this conversation begins to age me or date me because when I was in grad school in Fort Worth, Texas, we were having conversations at that time that Tarrant County was the number one or the highest, had the highest maternal morbidity and infant morbidity outcomes in the state. And a recent article as of this month has come out that Harris County, which is the place of my my home where I was raised, Harris County is the number one location in Texas. And so we're just finding that the data is moving across the state, but the problem is being shaped in different ways as we are ignoring the root causes of maternal morbidity and infant morbidity, or any outcomes that do not support health across the lifespan. So I want to provide that as the context to then just set this and where we are right now. We know that the Texas Maternal Mortality and Morbidity Review Committee has said that they will not review the data of the 3 years post SB 8, which is the legislation that triggered the total abortion ban in the state of Texas. That is them saying that they are going to outright ignore the data that indicates a larger and connected problem. And for this is the first place that we will provide pressure. Is to demand with expectation that the Maternal Mortality and Morbidity Review Committee in Texas and in all states lives up to what they are designed to do. It is a public health measure to ensure that folks have access to information and that we can understand both the branches of the problem and the roots of the shared condition. So that is our first stop. But there's so much more education and work that we have to do to continue to lift up this Black maternal health crisis that was not engineered by Black folks, but is ultimately a threat to our living and our existence. That's what we have for now.
Thank you so much, Raven. That is my final question for you for now, and I will pass it back to you, Jessica.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. And thank you so much, Raven, for sharing your expertise and taking the time out to talk to us today. So last but certainly not least, we have our third panelist is Sean Daniels. Sean Daniels is a political strategist with extensive experience managing campaigns, mobilizing voters, and developing advocacy programs. As Director of Campaigns and Programs at REPRO Rising Virginia, he leads efforts to engage and educate Virginians on reproductive freedom, ensuring that policies reflect the needs and values of the communities they serve. For more than 15 years, Sean has managed campaigns at every level, helping to elect leaders who stand up for fundamental freedoms. He has worked on or consulted for campaigns in 48 states, bringing a breadth of experience in political strategy, messaging, and operations. Before joining REPRO Rising Virginia, he served as executive director of the Virginia C4 table in Wynne, Virginia, where he worked to strengthen Democratic infrastructure and support candidates in key races. His background also includes work in direct mail consulting, digital advertising, and redistricting research. Sean specializes in coaching candidates, engineering turnaround operations for campaigns in crisis, and communicating effectively with diverse stakeholders. His ability to navigate complex political environments and bring people together around shared goals has made him a trusted voice in progressive politics. Before entering politics, Sean worked a wide range of jobs, including waiting tables, DJing, driving a dump truck, operating a drill rig, and managing public services and academic libraries. Experiences shaped his adaptability and problem-solving approaches to campaigns. He holds a BA in history from the University of Louisville and completed coursework for a master's in political communication at George Mason University. Sean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Great. My first question for you, Sean, is what are the biggest challenges that reproductive rights advocates in Virginia are facing in the campaign to pass the 2026 Reproductive Freedom Amendment?
Uh, I would say the biggest challenges are the same challenges that we always face. The stakes just feel a lot higher. The biggest challenge we're going to face is complacency for sure. I think that Virginia is an access state. We're the last state in the South where people can get have access to abortion care. Um, and in some ways, I think that that hurts us because people take things for granted. Um, I think that there's an impression out there that Virginia is this purplish, leaning blue state, and that everything is a-okay, and it's really not. We really do have to battle apathy and complacency, and then a whole lot of misinformation and misdirection that's going to be coming from the opposition. I think my biggest concern is that a lot of people will be voting on an amendment designed to guarantee their reproductive freedom, and they may not think that's what the amendment is about by the time we get to election day, because the opposition isn't going to be quiet. We've already seen a, a lot of work to, cast doubt and aspersions on the amendment and what it does. A lot of that being complete and total misinformation, and working people up into a frenzy that the amendment will do things that it just won't do. So that's honestly going to be our biggest issue, is just overcoming misinformation about the amendment and what it does, but also just people taking things for granted and thinking that they may not have to work as hard as they need to preserve the freedoms that we thankfully still have in Virginia.
Absolutely. And thank you for highlighting the taking for granted aspect as someone who grew up in Ohio when it was a purplish leaning blue state, and now solidly red. It is absolutely important that no matter where you are, to continue to push for reproductive freedom, but all freedoms, because we know the opposition will always push back against that. That leads into my next question for you is what have you found to be sort of the most effective ways to mobilize the voters and volunteers that are in support of Virginia's Reproductive Freedom Amendment?
So to be clear, the amendment is a group effort. There are dozens of organizations that have banded together. Repro Rising Virginia, who I work for, is one of them, and I'm going to talk specifically about some of the efforts that are specific and unique to our organization. There's much broader efforts going on across the state. Um, but what we have found is that relationships matter. They matter more than slogans or anything else. And so, to that end, we'll be putting a lot of our effort into what we call deep canvassing. where we have extended conversations with folks and help them connect their existing values um, to the policy that they're voting on. So, just to put a finer point on that, abortion care and politics, there's lots of politics, religion, abortion, money, all these things play into it, and these are topics that most people do not feel comfortable having extended conversations with their friends about. In fact, we're all pretty much told from a very early age to avoid having any kind of meaningful conversation about these topics. And so, one of the things that Repro Rising does is that we go into parts of the state where we suspect, and thus far it's been borne out to be true, that um, there's actually a lot of people who agree with the underlying tenets of the amendment, right? They agree that bodily autonomy is a value that they hold and want to see upheld by their government. Um, but they often just don't get an opportunity to talk about it. So one of the things we're doing is we're going out there and we're giving them an opportunity to ask questions without being afraid of being mocked or embarrassed or ridiculed. And we're just having extended conversations with folks about what the amendment is and what it does and what their values are and how does that connect with what this amendment does. And what we find is that, you know, easily more than 65% of the people in this Commonwealth want this amendment to pass. We just have to make sure that they're not tripped up on what it is and what it does, and that we keep connecting it back to the values they already hold. So honestly, it's really just the most powerful tool we have are going out and having meaningful conversations with people because they don't really need to be convinced. They just need to be reminded.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for doing that work. Deep canvassing is incredibly important. And thank you for sort of walking us through for folks who may not be familiar with how that looks. My final question for you right now is, have you had any interactions with anti-abortion individuals or organizations that oppose the Reproductive Freedom Amendment? And if so, what kind of rhetoric and strategies are they using to try to keep it from passing?
We definitely, yes, we have definitely had some interactions with the opposition. Um, and I'll tell you about a few of those. I just want to say up front, though, that their tactics are everything. I don't think you can hope to describe them in just one way and think that's where it's going to stay. I, Sometimes it's very emotional. Sometimes the tactics are very emotional, very worked up, very animated. Um, there's aspects of yelling, right? Like murderer and all the various things that the opponents will yell and say. But there's also a much softer approach where rather than coming at it with a lot of ferocity or animation, it's more trying to cast gentle doubts on what the amendment does, on what the language means. And so we actually see a big wide range of tactics, whatever might work in the setting that they find themselves in. We actually had, our big gala this past spring. Um, we had a bunch of opponents who broke in essentially, who forced their way into the venue. It was supposed to be a secure venue and made a real scene. Um, you know, chanted through this big public space. Marching and chanting, trying to take pictures and intimidate, our staff and our supporters. Um, just this last week, when we were in the session trying to show support for the legislators who are, passing this amendment and sending it on to the voters, uh, obviously the opposition was out in force, and we've seen a lot of efforts to talk about the same things that it always is about, you know, uh, abortions happening in certain circumstances, either later in pregnancies or, you know, claims about that somehow this would limit parental involvement or, all kinds of things that it wouldn't do. So I would say mostly what we see is um, mostly what we see is misinformation, and it's delivered in a variety of tones and contexts depending on what the setting is. It might be talking about, you know, bad health care received from a doctor and trying to blow that up into something that it's not, or it might just be religious calls and moral calls. It just depends on the setting. I think once we get out into the field, especially in some of the more rural parts of the state, we're going to see a lot more. We're going to see a lot. We're going to see a lot of language that is more inflamed, more frenetic, and more desperate the further we go and the closer we get to the election. We're already seeing
Yeah,
that in a few places. In fact, we're also seeing opposition trying to start working on local electeds to pass laws to try and hurt clinics and healthcare providers locally. Um, so it's going to take all manner of. It's going to take a lot to not only pass this but to protect it long term.
absolutely. And I'm sorry that happened at that event. But uh, helpful when you frame it in the previous question about sort of how to combat some of this mis and disinformation of just going out and ensuring folks have the facts of what they are voting on. Sean, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your expertise. I'm going to go ahead and move into the next portion because we have a couple of minutes left. Just flagging for folks that you can plug into REPRO Action campaigns at reproaction.org, and you can follow us on social media at reproaction pretty much everywhere. You can tune in for the next webinar by signing up for our email list, in which we will send out the date of the next one, so stay tuned. Um, and then for the Q&A section, we have a couple of minutes left. We've talked a lot about strategies that we've been seeing um, for both the progressive side and then what the opposition is doing. It's been very educational, but I wanted to take a moment to ask each of the panelists, how do you keep grounded in such important work when this we're not even at the end of January and it's felt like an eternity. Going into this year, I just wanted to go down the line and just ask how are you remaining grounded and keeping focus on the work that needs to be done going into 2026? And I'll go in the order that we started with. So Sydney, could you kick us off?
Um, well, I think yes, it has been a wild start to the new year, really daily concerns. Um, I think that I still have my New Year's resolutions in place and really trying to just stay grounded through meditating daily and doing yoga. I'll pass it to the next person.
Thanks, Sydney. This is Raven. I stay grounded through music. I like to create a lot of playlists for, a vibe that I may not experience yet, but I really want. And so, I hope that my February is mellow and deeply connected. So I'm curating a playlist about that right now.
I also love music. I think music is a great tool. But I would say what mostly keeps me grounded are the other people involved in the work. My colleagues and coworkers are just a fantastic group of people, and I think they do more than anything to help me stay optimistic and focused and grounded.
Great. Thank you all so much. I think it's super important as for the longevity of this work to focus on things that keep us sane. And those are great examples, relying on things that help you keep calm, help you focus on community, because the work that all of you do is incredibly important. And thank you all again so much for taking the time out to share your expertise and knowledge and break down what you're focusing on in this upcoming year. So I recommend anyone attending this webinar to check out the work that all these folks are doing. And thank you to Victoria for putting together this webinar.